a third of the people of the United States never knew anything about the war, not even that it happened. Their share in it was too short. The first bombs landed at 11:10 a.m. Washington time, and for 40 minutes they continued to drop by ones and twos and half dozens out of the empty space beyond the atmosphere. While they fell, the Army radars all over the country showed them as small moving specks darting into detection range upon invariable courses, all due south. Bombs moved due south to drop on San Francisco, and due south to hit Chicago, and due south to New York, and Dubuque, and Phoenix, and New Orleans.
Welcome to Our Nuclear Nightmares, a series examining the literature of the nuclear age. The following program contains material and themes that some listeners may find disturbing. Discretion is advised. This is Episode 1, The Murder of the USA. The year is 1946. French occupation forces in Vietnam, using the pretext of a dispute over the seizure of a Chinese trading vessel by local officials, demand all Vietnamese leave the French and Chinese sections of Haiphong. Before people can evacuate, the French open fire on the city from warships in the harbor, killing over 6,000. Kurdish and Azeri groups in Iran, backed by the Soviet Union, declare independence. Fighting breaks out between them and Iranian forces, which are backed by the Americans and British. The fighting only ends when the Soviets withdraw support after diplomatic pressure and negotiations with the Iranian premier. 2 nuclear weapons are detonated in the Marshall Islands as part of a series of tests for Operation Crossroads. The tests are a disaster, with participants exposed to more radiation than planned. Cleanup efforts fail to accomplish anything. The people of Bikini, removed before the tests, have never been able to return home. Murder of the USA was written by William Fitzgerald Jenkins and first published in the United States by Crown Publishers. Murder of the USA begins with a description of an attack on the United States, with every place with a population of 25,000 or more targeted with an atomic missile and obliterated. The novel then introduces Lieutenant Sam Burton, an officer in the Atomic Service who mans a burrow near the Rainier Glacier. Burrows are described as large underground silos equipped with extensive living facilities, greenhouses, and manufacturing capabilities for missiles and atomic warheads. Burton is watching security screens that are connected to an array of cameras outside the burrow, which have picked up 3 figures hiking over the ice. The burrows, which are supposed to be invisible to standard detection, are being methodically picked off one by one, and Burton is tense from waiting, unsure if or when his burrow will be next. As he waits, he reflects on the damage that's been inflicted on the United States.
When Washington vanished in a burst of flame, the means by which the news of the event should have reached, say, Chicago, vanished with Washington. Chicago turned into something resembling a section of the sun's photosphere with no inkling of any untoward event elsewhere. And Los Angeles disappeared between 2 seconds without even a radioed suspicion that the Gulf of New Mexico was roaring in to fill a great chasm where New Orleans had stood, or that the site of Manhattan Island had become a bubbling, boiling bay. All the normal means of transmitting news vanished with the cities, and more than population and teletype service vanished with them. With its cities gone, America fell apart into myriad isolated, crumbling small municipalities. No unit of government larger than a small municipality remained. No railroad ran, no power line functioned, no broadcasting station remained on the air. In 40 minutes of bombing, it became impossible to send a letter, a telegram, or a loaf of bread from one place to another in America.
Burton is joined at the screen by his friend, Major Fred Thale. Burton briefs Thale about the intruders that have been spotted out on the ice. He also notes that the only cabinet member to survive the attack, the Secretary of Agriculture, used an Army radio to announce his assumption of the presidency and a new government headquarters in Centralia, Pennsylvania, which was promptly destroyed by the enemy. Thale barely listens as he hasn't slept since the attack and is trying to come to grips with the death of his family, which was in St. Louis when the missiles hit. When Thale starts to waver due to his grief, Burton callously barks at him to get a hold of himself. Burton then asks and receives permission to send the base helicopter out to ambush and detain the intruders. The mission goes off without incident, but when the prisoners are sent off for interrogation, Burton realizes he knows one of them, Betty Clark, who he assumes is a spy due to prior history that's only hinted at. The novel then describes how various governments, France, Spain, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Poland, and even Bulgaria, have hunkered down in their respective bunkers and put their own burrows on alert. There's also a description of the Brienne Agreement, an agreement every nation on Earth has signed that states they will destroy any country that first uses nuclear weapons. As the perpetrator of the attack in the United States is still a mystery, this sends the population of nearly every major city in Europe into a frenzy, as they fear they may become a target of retaliation.
In Paris, waves of panic swept over a completely hysterical public. The Place Saint-Dominique unhappily formed the focus of 4 avenues which fed fugitives into it, while a straight, single, narrow street led towards the suburbs. It was filled to bursting. To stumble was to fall, and to fall was to die. Where the pressure was greatest, at the entrance to the narrow street, there was a terrible mound over which those who passed down the street must climb. The mound reached from house wall to house wall and was 10 feet high. It had been human beings.
Down in the burrow, Burton and Thale try to calculate the trajectory of the missiles so they can find the point of origin. After some back and forth, they deduce that the missiles are being launched from somewhere in the south, fly to the North Pole, then turn around to strike their targets. Burton and Thale also argue over the nature of the enemy attack and its purpose. In the middle of the argument, an orderly brings in Betty Clark, one of the intruders captured out on the ice. She offers to tell them how they found the burrow and how to take precautions to prevent it from being discovered. Clark relates how she, her brother Jerry, and Steve went out for a hike. They were using a pocket radio to listen to a station in New York when it went silent, followed by others also going off the air. They continued hiking but got lost and came across 2 strangers who, on being hailed, shot at them and then ran, but fell down a crevasse to their deaths. Clark, Steve, and Jerry retraced the steps of the strangers and found a radio transmitter buried in the snow. Burton believes that Clark is a liar and a spy, but Thale indicates he believes her story. When she's finished, she asks if someone can get a message to her family in Sacramento, but is told it's been destroyed. She nearly passes out from the shock of the news and is taken away. Thale sends a crew out to check on the crevasse for the transmitter and also has the math officer start calculations based on a hunch of his. Meanwhile, Burton resumes angrily pacing as he thinks over the events of the day.
Those who had been reared in the cities and survived them were doubly struck. Not only had they lost families or friends, their memories were crippled. It was no longer possible to remember anything of one's past without remembering also that it had ceased to exist. One's old home no longer existed. The parks, the schools, the soda fountain of high school years, the baseball lot, the gym where school dances were held and to which one took one's first date, these too were gone. The very substance of memory was destroyed. The effect was homesickness, acute and incurable. The most confirmed of misanthropes must hate this enemy who had destroyed the very substance of American life.
Burton thinks about how America has been devastated, then about his brief love for Clark when they had first met. However, the curiosity she and her friends had had for his secretive work made him suspect she was a spy and he had cut off all contact. Burton is interrupted by a loud warning that a missile is headed towards the burrow. He launches a newly constructed missile specially modified to intercept and destroy the enemy warhead. The missile works, and there is relief among the burrow personnel that's swiftly dampened by the realization the enemy will try again. Burton orders the interception method be broadcast to the other surviving burrows, but he suspects the enemy will concentrate everything on destroying his particular burrow. Burton picks an argument with Thale over security issues until the latter tells him to clear out for a while. Burton stalks through the burrow and makes his way to where Clark is being kept. He angrily accuses her of being a spy and threatens her with torture, which goes on for several pages until she can reason with him. Burton calms and grudgingly takes Clark on a tour of the burrow, showing off the hydroponics, the reactor for creating enriched uranium, the manufacturing plant for more missiles, and the room layout for the 900 personnel. As Burton leads Clark through the burrow, they pass by a missile being assembled.
The bomb came out of the tube and swung to one side. It looked long and sleek and horrible, but somehow it was distinctively an American product. No one could look at it and think of it as made anywhere but in the United States. It was somehow terrifying to see in an instrument of such destructiveness a family likeness to American automobiles and ice boxes, and transform planes and radios, and cigarette lighters and electric stoves. It was impossible to put a finger on that likeness, but if you looked at it, you knew its nationality.
The tour is occasionally interrupted as enemy missiles are intercepted by the burrow's anti-missiles. Thale meets up with Burton and they continue their argument about the enemy and make an educated guess that the missiles are coming from Antarctica. They rule out immediately bombarding the place as they suspect it's a remote base and the enemy headquarters is located elsewhere. Instead, they decide they want to land and search for evidence. They also express concern that the enemy will use a passing meteor shower to hide his missiles among the fast-moving radar signatures, which will make interception difficult. After Thale leaves, Clark asks Burton why he stopped talking to her years ago and why he has been so hostile towards her. Burton explains that he became suspicious of her questions and behavior during their brief relationship, and suspected her friends were pumping him for information. As they talk, the helicopter sent out earlier returns with the corpses of the strangers that Clark, Jerry, and Steve encountered. Burton recognizes one of the corpses as a former friend of Clark, which makes him even more convinced that she is a spy. The novel then shifts to describe European cities in the grip of fear.
Railroad trains steamed slowly through France, so incredibly crowded that the toppling of figures from the roofs of cars was no longer heeded by anyone. In Germany, the city folk were less numerous because their ruined cities were not yet rebuilt, but they were the most terrified of all, perhaps because they suspected themselves. They fled, their faces pinched not only with terror, but despair. Everywhere there were murders and robberies and rapings. There were looting and arson and revolt. Creatures of the slums proved again that the slums are the most deadly of national vices, and there were chaos and the certainty of the coming plague.
Several high-ranking officials who survived the initial attack arrive at the burrow and are brought inside, including a General Warsaw who attempts to take command but is rebuffed by Thale, who quotes regulations at him. The officials are bundled off into the burrow, and Thale tells Burton to interrogate Clark. However, Burton does not go to see Clark, but instead paces about the burrow again. Meanwhile, people work frantically on other methods for intercepting the enemy missiles, reasoning that the enemy is going to test out all possible solutions on them, and then use whichever one that works on the remaining burrows. The burrow sends up a missile equipped with cameras that spots an enemy missile hiding among the meteors and sends back images. As Burton and Thales watch the footage, the latter comments that he can feel the nationality of the weapon. Thale and Burton then go to see General Warsaw, who complains about his abrupt treatment, which Thale ignores, and asks Burton to escort the general to his room. Burton then heads to see Clark, who Thale has ordered to be put under a relaxed guard as if cleared of any suspicion, something that Burton takes badly. Burton finds Clark and relates some of the developments to her before breaking into another speech.
We can be knocked out at any time, simply by having so many bombs come at us that we can't handle them. But the people who bombed America will lose out. They have to, for things to make sense. Since atom bombs exist, it has to become certain that no people will ever again trust themselves to criminal fools of leaders with notions of conquest. Somehow, atom bombs make it necessary that no country shall ever dare sell itself to politicians for promises of glory.
Burton leaves Clark after admitting he may have been too quick to accuse her of being a spy. He rejoins Thales, who says they managed to knock down one of the enemy missiles without it detonating, and a team will be dispatched to take it apart and see if there are any clues as to who manufactured it. A Colonel Graves then arrives, accompanied by General Warsaw. Thales briefs Graves on what has happened so far, after which Graves has Clark brought into the room. On seeing Clark, Warsaw suddenly speaks up and says he's seen her before, and he is sure she's a foreign spy. Graves notes this information before suddenly hitting Warsaw hard enough to knock him unconscious. Graves reveals that Clark is a counter-espionage agent and that she was assigned to surveil the burrow and check out the personnel, including Burton, to make sure they weren't leaking secrets. Graves returns to his own burrow while Burton reconciles with Clark and Warsaw is dragged off, but before he can be interrogated, he commits suicide using a hidden poison capsule. Thales heads out to examine the crashed missile, knowing that he will almost certainly be killed in the process. Burton and Clark watch Thales using the video screens as he dismantles the missile and finds it composed of American parts ranging from Westinghouse to Delco. As he's working, the math officers break in to announce they have located the enemy launching sites and that they are in Antarctica. Burton orders a strike on Antarctica before the enemy can launch another salvo and tells Thales to evacuate, but he refuses as he is determined to keep working. Thales says he knows who put the missile together, a quote, old fellow with the bushy beard, unquote, but before he can elucidate, he is vaporized in the strike. Back at the burrow, Burton has the foreign dignitaries brought in to announce that the nation which attacked the United States has been identified, and missiles are already on their way to obliterate it. The guilty nation is not named, but is said to be in the South Atlantic and forbids the export of gold. Burton also says one of the parts purchases was traced back via a serial number on the downed missile. Burton then makes a speech to convince the other leaders to also launch their missiles under the Brienne Agreement.
We Americans are not sending bombs merely to kill our enemies. We are sending bombs also to save the lives of the hundreds of millions who will be murdered if men ever dare to become slaves again, or nations dare to be anything but free. I call upon every other nation to fulfill the Brienne Agreement, to destroy the nation which has invited destruction by the crime of murder. I demand the destruction of every city, every hamlet, every crossroad. I demand that the enemy country be turned into a waste of bomb craters, so that for 10,000 years to come, any man who thinks of war will look at it and have his blood turned to ice within him.
The other nations agree to launch, effectively obliterating the enemy nation from the surface of the earth. The wrap-up for the novel is barely a page, detailing how America is starting to rebuild and describing Burton sleeping on the mountain above the burrow with Clark sitting nearby. Murder of the USA is an earnest, intense, if uneven attempt to tackle both the technical and political prospects of the nuclear age. Although the first successful nuclear test by another nation was 4 years away, the novel describes a hostile power able to launch a technologically sophisticated first strike that virtually wipes out every city and large town in the United States. The power ascribed to the bombs, enough to vaporize an entire city, is unrealistic as it would require a yield in the tens of thousands of megatons, magnitudes larger than the yield of even the Tsar Bomba. However, it was not unreasonable for people to believe that developments in nuclear weapons would lead to superbombs. All information on yield limits was not only preliminary but classified. The photographs and newsreels that had been allowed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed a blasted landscape. It was easy for the public to believe that the same level of destruction could be visited on American cities. One columnist in the New York Times wrote, quote, "In that terrible flash 10,000 miles away, men and women in the capital had glimpsed the future of America," unquote. The enemy in the novel also targets lakes in order to create radioactive runoff, reflecting a concern that water could somehow become radioactive. But generally, fresh water lacks enough material in it that can make it radioactive. However, neutron bombardment of saltwater can create sodium-24, which has a half-life of around 15 hours, and chlorine-36, which has a half-life of around 300,000 years. During the shallow water explosion of the Baker test during Operation Crosswinds, the waves and spray hit the target ships, resulting in elevated radiation levels. The idea that an enemy would use long-range missiles is an extrapolation from the V-2 rocket program that the Third Reich had used against the United Kingdom. There was also a speech Hitler had given in 1944, hinting at the development of an improved version that would be able to reach the United States. This weapon, named Project America, only existed on paper, and it's unclear whether the submarine-towed rocket system had even completed testing before the war ended. However, everyone understood that rocket technology would advance, though it would take longer than expected. The first ICBM, the Soviet R-7 Semyorka, would not be launched until 1957, while the United States SM-65 Atlas would not become operational until 1959. The novel also has some surprisingly advanced ideas for missile defense. Programs for developing anti-ballistic missiles only started in the 50s, and quickly ran into the problem that there were no systems capable of performing the calculations necessary for an intercept. This led designers to put forward the idea of arming anti-ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, with the theory that the size of the explosion could knock out an incoming missile. This became the basis of the Sprint missile, part of the Nike X anti-ballistic missile system deployed in 1975. The Sprint used a low-yield W-66 warhead, which was designed to destroy an enemy missile with a kinetic explosion, or knock it out with the neutron flux and X-ray effects that accompanied the detonation. The Burrows are another inspiration possibly taken from the Third Reich and their La Coupole base in occupied France, which constructed and fueled V-2 rockets underground before rolling them out for launch. The first United States missile silo was arguably the Atlas F system built in 1963, though this still required the missile to be raised in order to launch. The first self-contained American underground missile silo was the Titan II, which occupied a 600-square-foot area and had a mess and sleeping quarters for 4 personnel. If you're curious, you can take a tour of one at the Titan Missile Museum located near Tucson, Arizona. The first Soviet silo was built at Plokshtin in Lithuania for the R-12 Divina missile system. This facility was turned into a museum in 2012 and is open to the public. In fact, early on, Bernard Brodie, one of the first and most influential nuclear strategists for the United States government, suggested building a large-scale, independent, secret, and underground nuclear system as a method of deterrence. For writers like Jenkins, who were not privy to high-level government talks, many of their ideas came from reading magazines and science journals, some commonly available, some more obscure. The author sometimes even has footnotes in the novel showing where he came across a particular idea. The reason for this comes from an incident in 1944 when writer Cleve Cartmill's short story Deadline, which described the use and general design of the atomic bomb, was published in Astounding Science Fiction magazine. This caused a panic in the government, which sent the FBI to interrogate dozens of science fiction writers to ascertain if there had been a security breach. One of the people they questioned was Jenkins, who proved the information he used was readily available in technical magazines and newsletters. In fact, around the same time Murder of the USA was published, Life magazine put out an issue with an article titled The 36-Hour War, which speculated on the possible outcome of a future nuclear war and featured illustrations for intercontinental ballistic missiles and underground missile silos. Where technical publications lacked coverage, however, was about the long-term effects of fallout. Some of this was due to a lack of information, but also because the government was deliberately withholding data. This led many to mistakenly believe that the after effects of a nuclear war were minimal. This allowed Jenkins to believe that rebuilding while challenging would be possible. Arguably the most interesting part of the novel is not its synthesis of technical ideas, but when, during an argument, Major Thale says, quote, "The Burrows make the whole thing simply stupid. They aren't fighting weapons, they aren't conquering weapons, they're just killing weapons. We didn't conquer Japan, just its government. You can't conquer anybody with bombs. They're not that sort of weapon," unquote. This observation illustrates one of the fundamental issues with American strategic nuclear planning throughout the Cold War, during which time most planners doggedly insisted that nuclear weapons were capable of ending a war, the belief that their sheer destructive capabilities could force an enemy to surrender. Yet it was a belief that neither side really held, for both the United States and the Soviet Union embarked on the creation of continuity of government structures, shelters, and increasing nuclear stockpiles for deterrence. This schizophrenic approach was emblematic of a larger argument about how to deal with the danger that nuclear weapons posed. The novel argues for deterrence and proposes the Briand Agreement that obligates all nations to obliterate anyone that uses nuclear weapons. There's no discussion of having a one-world government, disarmament, or any other options. It's a dark vision of a world where people live in terror of one another. The author believed that the use of atomic bombs was an outrage, but likely inevitable, and war had to be treated like a crime and punished accordingly. He saw war as stemming from fanatic or venal politicians rather than larger systems, something he saw as a risk on both sides of the Cold War, for while he considered the Soviet Union a threat, he did not have the rabid anti-communism of many of his colleagues. However, there's still a strong suggestion in the novel that only nations that adopt American-style democracy can prevent a nuclear war. This ignores how there was no democratic vote on using the atomic bomb on Japan, nor would the public be consulted by various administrations who considered using the bomb in Vietnam, Korea, and Berlin. The public itself was unsure about the bomb. Initially, there was majority support over the use of atomic bombs on Japan. One Gallup poll found an 85% approval rating, but that support concealed a wide range of opinions. Other polls showed that while a slight majority approved of using both bombs, almost 15% had wished there had been a demonstration over an unpopulated area, while 22% wished more bombs had been dropped on Japan. There was also a marked difference in opinions to what the future held. Some colonists wrote with the belief that God had given the United States the bomb, and it was a gift meant to ensure freedom. Others were less sanguine. One column in the Washington Post wrote that it seemed like the life expectancy of the human race had been drastically shortened. These incoherent reactions is why people voiced such strong opinions over the next decades in newspapers, movies, radio programs, and novels. This incoherence would also extend to the imagined enemies that would threaten the United States. Although most people believed the Soviet Union would be the next nation to develop an atomic weapon, there was still reluctance to see a wartime ally as an enemy. As such, this novel and many other stories created fictional or nameless enemies. This leads to a weakness in many stories in that there was no context established for a conflict. There was no lead-up of political tensions, conventional clashes, or other incidents. In this novel, this makes the enemy one-dimensional, a pure villain that is easy to hate. It would be easy to label this novel as an argument for vengeance, but it is more a struggle to construct a method of deterrence. It was a struggle that would come to define the nuclear age. If you found this episode interesting, entertaining, or a useful sleeping aid, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. This series is only possible through listener support. You can also help by leaving a review on iTunes or Spotify.